Good morning, good morning, good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. Welcome, welcome, welcome to all of you who are with me today by either live stream YouTube or by Periscope. All right. So, good morning. I hope that everybody has had a wonderful weekend. I hope that you are having a good day. Before we begin this book talk, I want to say my spiel about what's going to happen in a little over 24 hours, right? We will be announcing, the end of the world doesn't happen. If a terrorist act isn't committed, if martial law is not instigated, or any of these other things that people are saying and talking about, we will be receiving a new commander-in-chief. And we know how that went the last 8 years. Some people were excited. Some people were terrified. Some people were happy. Some people were saying, not my president. And they said that continuously for the entire 8 years. I'm sure that we're going to get, probably maybe 20-30% of the country saying that again about whoever it is that becomes our commander-in-chief. You're going to have people that will spend the next 4 years saying, that's not my president, whether it's a madam or whether it's a mister. So I wanted to say just a couple of things before we go into our reading about this election. No, I am not predicting who will win. I do recall last election, my husband had a dream about who the president would be, and he was correct. And matter of fact, in his dream, he saw Barack Obama being elected twice, and that was in 2007, before the elections happened. So he knew that he would be elected twice, and that word obviously came to pass. So I'm not here to do that. What I am here to say is that just as like we are having these conversations about race, whoever gets elected is going to have these conversations. These conversations across our country are going to have to continue, right? We're going to have to talk about the divisions in our country. You can no longer sit back and wonder whether or not our country has been divided, whether or not our country has been torn apart spiritually, and in some ways culturally, right? Many people who say they're proud to be an American, that can stand for a whole lot of things. So are you proud to be an American because of the freedoms that you enjoy? Are you proud to be an American because, you think that this land is only for white people? What makes you, quote unquote, proud to be an American? Those are questions, those are things that people are going to have to deal with in their own selves. They're going to have to deal with in their own psyche, right? What does that mean to be an American? Does that mean that certain people get rights and everybody else just kind of has to deal with whatever pieces of the quote unquote American dream that they can manage to eke out? Does that mean that everybody is really going to be treated equally or to be treated equitably or fairly? When we talk about proud to be an American, are we proud of how we got our land, right? Or are we willing to say, what some of our ancestors did and how they went about things was not of God, even though they attached God's name to it? even though they use words like manifest destiny and said that it was God's will for us to go and kill and rape and torture and murder and steal and conquer another people in the name of our God. Like, are we willing to, as a nation and as a country, really examine some of these things that we believe or that we have been taught, right? So again, long after the election is over, long after the election process is over, we're still going to have to deal with each other in this country as quote unquote Americans. Okay? The country of origin, Black Americans, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Mexican Americans, Irish Americans, Italian Americans. So, you know, hopefully what we have learned from this process, I know, is that you are learning where the people are in your life and where they stand. What do they believe in? What do they see as equitable? What values are shaping their life? A lot of people are saying, well, you shouldn't judge me based on the person that I chose to elect to office. Well, listen, fruit speaks. Fruit speaks. We know we have been given horrible choices, but we've also been given the write-in slot on your election ballot. Most states have that. So if you have been the person that has been, you know, vacillating between the lesser of two evils, listen, they were both evil candidates in their own ways, in shapes and forms. You know, some people have talked about the fact that, well, this person is doing evil in office and this person is not in office, but they're just a bad person. Listen, one person might have been doing evil while they're in office. The other person was doing evil, ripping people off, not following through with their business commitments. So you can't say that one was not doing wrong when both candidates, if you will be honest, both candidates were doing wrong. One was just doing wrong while holding public office, and the other candidate has done wrong to small business owners. They've evaded paying taxes. They've admitted on camera that, you know, they like to grope women without even giving them permission. So you can't look at both candidates and say one is an angel and the other one is not. The reality is both of them had their flaws. Again, in less than 24 hours, we're going to have to deal with one of these people leading the free world. Tonight at 9 p.m., all across the country, there's about 2,700 people who will be joined together at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and they will be praying for this nation. It's going to be Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, Green Party people, Tea Party people, all kinds of people are going to be praying for the future of this nation. So I invite you, wherever you are in your, you know, whether you're at work, whether you're in your home, whether you are at church, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, about 2,700 people are going to be praying simultaneously for our nation, for our country. So I invite you to join in that prayer wherever you are. Pray for the future of our country. Pray for the future of our country. Because one thing I will say, as we go into our book reading at this time, one thing I will say is the enemy, those who hate this country for various reasons, are waiting for you all, for us, to be in such a disagreement with each other that we are not prepared for an invasion, to be in such a disagreement with each other that the enemy can use us in the country against each other. So I don't want to be a part of that. I don't want to be tied into that. I want to make sure that I am practicing what I preach, and that is to love all men, regardless of their political stance, regardless of their religious faith, regardless of their sexual orientation. My call is to love you and to treat you like Christ would. So that is my spiel on this election. Regardless of who becomes president, Jesus is still Lord of my life. Jesus is still Lord of my household. Jesus is still Lord of my increase. So that is the confidence that I have. He was Lord 4 years ago. He was Lord 8 years ago. And as far as I'm concerned for my life, he's going to continue to be Lord. When the economy said no, God said yes. When the job market said no, God said yes. When the housing market crashed, God still said, I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to keep you in perfect peace as your mind is stayed on me. So that's what I have to say. In case those of you are wondering where I stood. We're going into our reading for today. We're on day 22 of White Like Me. And believe it or not, we've got just about 8 days to go to finish this book. And so that means we will hit right in the middle of November with finishing this book. And then we will go on to our next book, Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. So let me warm up my vocal cords here. And let us get to reading our section for today. And it's actually a very short section, so this is good. Tim Wise is an anti-racist activist. He is based out of Nashville, Tennessee. He is a frequent media commentator on race issues. And if you'd like to find out more about Tim Wise himself, you can go to timwise.org. Today we pick up reading about Tim Wise's professional experiences. Let's continue. In addition to Agenda for Children, the spring of 1995 brought with it yet another professional opportunity. In the summer of the previous year, one of the only good things to happen that had been that a Progressive Speakers Bureau in California, Speak Out, had called to let me know that they'd like to add me to their roster of speakers, educators, and artists. Though they couldn't promise me that I'd get any speaking engagements, they were going to add me to their catalog, which they sent each year to thousands of colleges and other organizations. I had actually sent them a packet of material back in 1993, thinking that perhaps the lessons of the anti-Duke campaigns would be of interest to folks across the nation, but they had turned me down. Undaunted, I had applied again the next year, and this time they had found a place for me. Don't quit your day job, they had counseled, which was no problem, seeing as how I didn't have one at the time. But hopefully they'd be able to get me out on the road where I could share my own insights and meet with organizers and activists around the country. In March of 1995, I got my first speaking engagement at the Chicago Teacher Center and Northeastern Illinois University, respectively. It was bitter cold and I was running a fever by the time I got to Midway Airport, but I did the best I could under the circumstances. At Northwestern, I spoke to a number of sociology classes about everything from affirmative action to hate crime activity to media-generated racial stereotypes. After one of my talks, a young white woman in the front row raised her hand and somewhat tentatively and asked how I was received doing this work as a white man by Black people. I asked why she was curious about this, trying to figure out the motivation for her question. Well, she said, I would love to do the kind of work you do, but I'm afraid Black people won't trust me, won't accept my contribution, and so I'm just wondering how you think Black folks feel about you. Do you think they like you or that they still don't really trust you? Although I was brand new to nationwide lecturing, I had been doing anti-racism work in some capacity for several years and was working in several Black communities in New Orleans. So I explained that based on my experience, I had never personally felt any hatred or resentment on the part of Black folks. Of course, there's going to be some mistrust up front, and in fact, I'd be worried about any person of color who didn't look at whites who choose to fight racism a bit suspiciously. They've been burned too many times to take it for granted that they're serious and in it for the long haul. It was then that I noticed a young Black woman in the back row who had her hand up and wanted desperately to talk. I had observed her facial expressions all throughout my speech, and I could read her body language well enough to know that she simply wasn't buying anything I was selling. Thinking this might make for an interesting interaction given the white woman's fears and concerns, not to mention the African American woman clearly wanted to be called on, I pointed to her and asked her for her input. Her response was classic and perfect for the situation. Make no mistake, she insisted. We do hate you and we don't trust you, not for 1 minute. I thought the white woman in the front row was going to come unglued, as if her classmate's comment had only confirmed her worst fears. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, I said to the Black woman who had made the statement, since after all, you don't know me, but that's fine, because I'm sure you haven't got much reason to trust me, and anyway, ultimately, I'm not doing this for you. The room was deathly silent at that point, no one quite knowing what to make of a proclamation such as that. I mean no disrespect, I explained. It's just that I'm not fighting racism to save you from it. That would be paternalistic. It would be like saying that Black folks aren't capable of liberating yourselves from white supremacy. I think you are, though it might be easier with some internal resistance from whites. But regardless, I fight racism because racism is a sickness in my community and it damages me. Wow and wow and wow again. Because I'm so glad that Tim Wise says this, because one thing I do recognize is that many white people do not believe that racism is a sickness. Many white people do not believe that it is damaging to them as well as to Black America. Because if you really believe that it was damaging, you would make a more concerted effort to deal with the racism that you see, the racism that you hear, the racism that is spewed out when Black people or even people of color are not around. So I appreciate the fact that Tim Wise says, I fight racism because racism is a sickness in my community and it damages me. We're always being lectured about the Black community. We're always being lectured about what's wrong with the Black community. We are always being lectured about what needs to be fixed in the Black community. But I rarely see anybody saying that racism is an illness in the white community and it needs to be dealt with because it's damaging to all white Americans. Yeah. And good morning and welcome to those of you who are joining us live. I explained to the young white woman that if she wanted to do this work for Black people, then of course they wouldn't trust her. White missionaries have rarely brought things of lasting value to peoples of color. If, on the other hand, she wanted to do it because it was the right thing to do, and because she no longer wanted to collaborate by way of her silence, then what the woman in the back thought of her sincerity should not matter. And if she really did the work and proved herself, Black and brown folks, including the woman who made her so nervous that day, would likely recognize her seriousness and work with her. Or not. Either way, why should it matter? People of color don't owe us gratitude when we speak out against racism. They don't owe us a pat on the back. And if all they do is respond to our efforts with a terse "about time," that's fine. Challenging racism and white supremacy is what we should be doing. Resistance is what we need to do for us. Although people of color have often thanked me for the work I do, it's a thanks that I am not owed. And whenever it's offered, I make sure to repay the compliment. Accountability demands it. While much discussion had recently been about whether or not America should apologize for slavery, and I happen to think apologies are pretty empty, absent substantive reparations and recompense, perhaps before we focus on apologies, we could simply say thank you to people of color for pointing the way when it comes to resistance. People of color owe us nothing, but we owe them at least that much and a lot more. Being able to teach, yes, being able to teach that to another white person, and on my first day out suggested that perhaps there was something to this traveling educator thing after all. Perhaps the potential impact of such work was far greater than I imagined. And we're coming into our last two sections today. I told you it's going to be really, really quick. If you're just coming in to the broadcast, you can make sure you go back and watch from the beginning, as I do give my spiel for the elections and election day. By late 1995, I was really starting to grow fond of the road, though there was part of me that intuitively recognized the dangers of going down that path. It was eerily similar to what my father had done for all of those years as a comic and actor. There was another part of me that thrived on it, and it wasn't because I was speaking to overflowing auditoriums or reaping the standing ovations of adoring crowds, because in neither case was that true. Fact is, almost nobody knew who I was. I was only 27 by the fall of that year and hardly a common name within the anti-racism community. Far from receiving rock star treatment, the first few months of the circuit had been more like struggling band riding around in a grimy van than anything else, but I still loved it. Maybe it was because as an only child, the child of an alcoholic, I had grown up having to be self-directed and find ways to engage my brain with no one else around. It was one of the reasons I never really proved to be very good working in organizational settings. No matter how much I loved the organizations for which I was working, my wiring going back to my childhood was set on solo mode. I liked being alone with my thoughts, having to represent no one's views but my own. Not to mention, I also loved getting to meet activists, especially young activists all over the country. There would be high points that first year, like being picketed by anti-gay bigot Fred Phelps and his family during an event at Kansas University, and also several low points. Among the latter, my two favorites were speaking at the University of West Alabama to 5 people in the basement of the student center, 2 of whom were playing pool, and then speaking in Rensselaer, Indiana at St. Joseph's and staying in a hotel room infested with flies, from which the only relief would be a fly swatter handed to me by the clerk when I asked if there was any way I could change rooms. Glamorous this was not, but it was what I felt I needed to be doing. Of course, this posed a bit of a dilemma. I was still at Agenda and dearly loved the people there, but by early 1996, I knew I would need to make a choice. Though I wasn't traveling much, even the little bit I was doing was becoming a problem for my job. This will be especially obvious after I went to New York to appear on a TV show only to get stuck in the city for 3 extra days by the worst blizzard New York had seen in a century. Returning finally to New Orleans, it was pretty apparent that my work was suffering from my other commitments. Additionally, I was coming to realize that as much as I loved the organizing work, I wasn't actually that good at it. I never had been, though I'd hoped that I might grow into it over time. But feeling that the work was too important to be done halfway or halfway well, I decided to move on. In fact, not only did I leave Agenda for Children in February, I decided to leave New Orleans altogether by summer. As much as I loved the city, it was time for a change. Being untethered to any particular organizational structure, I was free to go wherever I might feel like living. Since I wasn't sure where I might want to live next, I decided to start by moving home to Nashville. Although my mom had moved from our old apartment, she was still there, living with my grandmother for the previous 2 years at that point. and my best friend Albert and his friend Dana were too. If I had to start anew, what better place than from home? As the middle of August rolled around, and as the life-deadening heat that came with it rolled into, it was an easy walk away from New Orleans. So I did. All right, so the last piece here is going to be a lesson that Tim would learn about white privilege, and then we're going to be done with our reading for today. Before getting home, however, there would be one more lesson about white privilege to learn. But first, a little backstory. Each morning, until shortly after 9 o'clock, it was common for those of us at Agenda for Children to have the office television on, just to stay up on the day's early events. But on April 19, 1995, before we would have a chance to turn off the set, breaking news came over the networks, followed by some of the most shocking footage any of us had seen up to that point or would ever see, at least until a little more than 6 years later. As we stood slack-jawed before the small screen, video from Oklahoma City was coming in, where the Murrah Federal Building had just had its front end blown off by a 5,000-pound bomb that had been planted in a truck outside. Speculation immediately focused on one or another Muslim terrorist. Perhaps it was Saddam Hussein, some said, or Hezbollah, said others. Within hours, mosques around Oklahoma City would be raided in hopes of finding evidence to implicate those who most assumed were responsible. Of course, the perpetrators would be none of these. As we would learn within the next 2 days, the terrorists were white men named Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, who had no compunction about killing innocent people, including children, in the building's daycare center. Just to make some twisted political point, ultimately, 168 people would die, and hundreds more would be injured thanks to the fulfillment of Tim McVeigh's bloodlust, fueled by right-wing anti-government hysteria and his admiration for racist fantasy novels like the Turner Diaries, parts of which were found in his car, and the details of which he copied almost perfectly in the Oklahoma City bombing. That the Army had trained this lunatic to kill and to view enemies as utterly expendable only added pathetic and maddening context to a crime that was already bad enough. Fast forward now to August 1996. McVeigh is awaiting trial, and I'm moving home to Nashville. To make that move, in spite of the fact that Nicole had virtually cleaned me out 18 months earlier, I had by then accumulated enough stuff to require the renting of a truck to complete the task. The closest moving truck company to my home happened to be a Ryder Truck franchise, the same company that had been used by McVeigh. So when I was ready to load boxes and furniture, I headed down to the Ryder location and asked for a truck. It would be the same size and model as the one Tim McVeigh had used to bring down the Murrah building. I walked in, put my license and credit card on the counter, and within 15 minutes, I was headed to my house to load up. I am white. I am male. I have short hair. At the time, I was clean shaven. My name is Tim. All of which is to say that I fit the profile of the nation's deadliest terrorists in 5 different ways. Yet no one at Ryder thought to ask for an additional security deposit just in case I decided to fill their truck with explosives and take out a city block. No one looked at me funny, ran a background check, or said anything at all other than, "Mr. Wise, will you be needing a map?" That was it. They could tell the difference, or thought they could, between that Timothy and this Timothy. That's what it means to be white. The murderous actions of one white person do not cause every other white person to be viewed in the same light, just as the incompetence or criminality of a white person in corporation or on Wall Street does not result in other whites being viewed with suspicion as probable incompetents or crooks. Whites can take it for granted that we'll likely be viewed as individuals representing nothing greater than our solitary selves. Would that persons of color would say the same even before September 11, 2001, let alone after. That last point. What's a more recent example? Thank you all for joining me. That was our reading for today. A more recent example of that I can think of is what happened in Dallas with the Dallas shooter. That as the Black Lives Matter and other people were protesting, because it wasn't just Black Lives Matter that was protesting in Dallas, and they were marching, right? And the African American guy was a sniper, and he took out 5 police officers. He specifically said, before they blew him up with a robot bomb, he specifically said, "I am acting alone. Nobody put me up to do this. I'm choosing to do this myself," right? And they blew him up. We're not even going to talk about why they blew him up, but they take everybody else in alive for shooting police officers. But the point is, even as this man, what they got out of him, even as he said, "I'm acting alone, I am not a part of Black Lives Matter," the very first people that were blamed was the Black Lives Matter organization. Now, I'm not a part of Black Lives Matter organization, but I do believe in the sentiment that Black Lives Matter and that all people's lives matter, all souls matter. But Tim Wise makes a very good point there. He said in 5 different ways he fit the description of Timothy McVeigh that blew up the building, the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. But nobody profiled him. Nobody looked at him and said, "I don't know about renting to you. Let me do some extra background on you." He made a point of saying that he was judged as an individual solitarily apart from his own people group. There was several weeks after what happened with the Dallas police officers that I heard people saying, "Oh, Black people hate cops," or "Black people want to kill cops," or it's the Black Lives Matter people, when it was entirely untrue. But guess what? As he said, an entire group of people got blamed for one man's actions. So that's what he was talking about in terms of, that's an example of white privilege, how he was not judged by his individual actions, was not blamed on an entire people group. Are there people that should be charged for crime? Are there people that do evil things? Yes. But when you start categorizing an entire people group as being that way, that's when you get in trouble. I hope that I said something today that would spark your thinking. I hope that you would join me tomorrow, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. This is our reading time for today. If you're just jumping in, please go back to the beginning and read along with us. I encourage you to pick up the book, White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Tim Wise. Again, thank you for taking time out of your day. Thank you for taking time out of your morning. I will be back today to do a separate broadcast about my experience at the National African American Museum of History and Culture here in the DC area. I'll tell you a little bit about my experience. I'll tell you a little bit about what I got out of the visit. And if you have tickets to go, I'll tell you a little bit about that. I'll give you some freebie tips on how to get in and get out, because DC is something else to be driving into. So I'll offer you some tips, and I'll show you some things that are available in the museum that you may want to check out, in the gift shop that you may want to check out if you go. All right, I will see you back later today. Take care and God bless. Again, if you'd like to catch that review of the museum, it will actually be on my Periscope page, and you can go to www.periscope.tv/LifeNation. Life Nation. Or if you have a Periscope account, all you have to do is search for Life Nation, one word, and it will pull up my Periscope page. And you can follow us there as well. All right. Thank you again for joining us. Take care and God bless.